All right, so looks like we have a good amount of people joined up. So we'll start things off. Welcome to our 2020 cybersecurity webinar. Goal here today is just to educate people on some of the best practices around data security, discuss some ransomware protection strategies, talk about some auditing requirements for security and compliance. If you do have questions at any point, go ahead and type them in the chat window here. We'll try and answer them as we go. But we've also reserved some time at the end for a Q&A session. So we'll try and cover as many of those as possible. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm on the sales and business team here at Superna. Joining me, we have Dorothy Stockberger. She's the executive VP, and Andrew McKay, president of Superna. So I guess let's just begin with, the topic that's top of mind for a lot of Isilon users is ransomware protection. So Andrew, what are some key strategies for addressing this threat and for securing data?
Yeah, so we have a bit of an agenda for today, but the amount of questions and calls we have with customers around data security and ransomware and AirGap or vaulting or whatever you want to call it, there's a lot to cover there. So we're going to spend some time covering that solution and considerations and technologies and best practices. We'll be talking about air gapping, things you want to consider when looking to invest in we call it the third copy. There's production DR and a third copy. We're also going to go on to some other common data protection things like data loss prevention, mass delete, some other capabilities to protect data besides ransomware. There's many threats to data. So we'll even look at some of the network aware solutions that we have and even look at some content analysis security solutions that we can offer as well. So I think before we dive into the topics, we thought it would be useful to do a bit of a recap on our ransomware solution because it's the key to many of the things we're going to talk about. So I think that's one thing we want to do before we sort of launch into the main topic.
Sure, yeah. So let's talk a bit about, stopping ransomware attacks at the source. So what does that look like with the Ransomware Defender product?
Hi, thanks. So certainly the primary defense for Ransomware Defender is to stop it at the source, right? That's your number one objective. And then certainly secondarily, as Andrew mentioned, today we're going to also be talking about an AirGap solution, a third copy. We mention it here as the copy of last resort. But right now, I just wanted to do a quick recap of the Ransomware Defender, which is the Superna product that is related to stopping ransomware at the source, right? So how does it fit into your security strategy? In addition to your outer perimeter endpoint security measures, such as virus scanning, firewall rules, etc. When you add in the Ransomware Defender, what it's doing is real-time monitoring activity on your Isilon and checking whether anything has actually made it through that outer security perimeter. So quick recap on, what is Ransomware Defender doing? It's doing real-time analysis for user behavior, and it's data type agnostic. It doesn't use signature files, as well as honeypot files to bait ransomware to detect a ground zero ransomware infection. Lastly, there are also 2,000 plus known extensions that we're monitoring for as well. Now, detection is part of the solution, but the second part of the solution is what can we do to help limit the damage, right? If something's made it through. So Ransomware Defender is able to automatically block access to the individual user associated with the security event. And so why is that important? Why do we care about that? Well, it's going to reduce your recovery time and cost, since once that block is in place, no further files can be encrypted, right? We can automatically create Isilon read-only snapshots as a recovery source. Now, why is this important? You have snapshots schedules likely already, right? Well, it's going to improve on your recovery options since it's been created closer to the ground zero time of the infection, right? which means more data can be recovered. You can leave the Ransomware Defender running and it can monitor user behavior during your recovery phase, right? You can make sure that you've got no new infections happening before your recovery phase happens. And it's a learning system, right? It can learn behaviors that are unique in each environment. So let's take a look. What does that look like in the product itself? All right, so we've, this is a detection, right, that shows up here in the window. So what are you going to know about your detection once it's happened? We're going to track the files that were involved in the detection, right? If I can click through here before it refreshes. So now you know the scope of the recovery required, right? It's going to avoid you having to revert entire snapshot and losing changes for files that weren't actually affected. We're going to know the user, right, who's associated with the security event. Now, I did want to mention at this point that we do see environments where shares are being configured with run as root permissions. And it's important to be aware that if you use run as root on your SMB share, no lockout is possible, right? When the audit event is logged on Isilon, the user associated is root, not the actual user who was logged in. And root can't be locked out. Essentially, applying a deny permission has no effect for the root user. If we locked out shares, right, you would have the list of shares that were affected. And if we created snapshots, right, you would know exactly which snapshots had been detected. And I think the other really nice piece of information that is in the audit event and that we're able to provide to you is the client IP. So we're essentially subnet aware detection, right? You're going to know exactly where that user was connected from. And now you have, you know where to go, right? You have procedures and policies that you have to follow when a security event happens. And this will simplify that for you as well.
Great. So Andrew, I'll direct this one over to you. We saw the Ransomware Defender product there with Dorothy. What other technologies do we have available to add some layers of protection, simplify any remediation for Isilon environments?
Yeah, so this is probably the number one sort of topic, how and what technology should I use to make an extra copy of my data? So I'll call it the third copy or the vault copy. So there's traditional backup software that we see. There's, of course, replication. Snapshots are good, of course, because that's a point in time. And then data retention is usually a key consideration. We also see a lot of requests around S3 and cloud storage like Amazon or Azure. So we see a lot of questions around that. And there's some pros and cons that really matter, in making that decision. So,
would S3 object storage, would that be a viable solution to get a secured third copy of data? Is that something that's viable?
So this is probably the number one question that we get, and it's the details matter here. So let me start with, I'll use cloud storage, Amazon, Azure. So yeah, it's certainly lower cost. So that's good. But when you start looking at the details, one of the objectives in making a third copy that should never be overlooked is what's my time to recovery, because you're making this extra copy for the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is you don't trust the source copies. That would be production, that would be DR. You don't trust them. For whatever reason, those copies you've decided, I don't want to use those copies. And now you're looking at using your third copy. So to use that third copy, and I'll use numbers like 500 terabyte, a petabyte, a lot of environments have a large amount of data that they would like to make that extra copy. How quickly can I use that copy? Well, if I use the S3 example and you move, I'll just, for the sake of this example, I'll move a petabyte of data into Amazon as objects. How quickly can I get that petabyte back? Well, realistically, You're not going to bring that down over the internet. That's probably weeks of copying. So that's not really a viable option. If I'm going to restore that data or bring it back, it's not useful to me in object format. I need it in a file format. So that means you have to go from object back to file. And now I'm going to be worried about things. Well, okay, I have my data back on a file serving device. I need all my security back. I need my shares, my exports. I mean, the data by itself is not horribly useful unless all the security comes with it. So then there's the consideration of getting the data out to, say it's Amazon or Azure. That's a slow process. And then what's the number one goal when making that copy? Well, ultimately, the best solution is to make a copy of that data, track versions of that data, because data gets updated. So keep multiple versions and keep the versions for as long as you can afford. That would be the goal. You want as many options to restore or recover your data. You want more, not less. And you want to keep more options as long as you can possibly can that's affordable. So now let's look at versioning, because if I have a file and the file changes and I want to keep both versions, let's just take a look at what happens with S3. S3 supports versioning. Every object target supports versioning. But those are full copies. Buckets that support versioning store a full copy of the version. So I'll use a 1 gigabyte file example. I have a 1 gig file. I make a small change to that 1 gig file. I copy that 1 gig file into the object store, and I now have 2 versions. That's great. I have 2 versions. But I am also paying to store 2 gigabytes of data. There's no block level differencing between versions. There's no savings. Even though there's only 1 byte difference between those 2 versions, you're going to pay for 2 gigabytes of storage. And if you want 3 versions, well, that's 3 gigabytes of storage and so on. So the cost advantage that may look like it's attractive on S3 rapidly evaporates as soon as you start looking at versioning your data and then retaining those versions for long periods of time. So if I use a 7-day example and a file changes once every day to 1 gig file, and I have 7 gigs worth of data and 7 versions, and I want to store that for months, ideally, that adds up if you multiply that times the change rate of a file system that in some cases, 50% of the changes in a day are changes to existing files. It's not new data, it's just small changes to existing data. So rapidly the cost of S3 would disappear. And then there's the pros and cons of getting it all back. Just because you have versions doesn't mean those versions are easily accessible. And then I need a file server. So there's many issues around S3 from a cost standpoint, from a speed standpoint. And so there's obviously other solutions that we think are better.
Sure. So let's do a quick comparison then of between that S3 option and our AirGap 2.0 here. So if you could take us through, a comparison of this solution.
Yeah. So if we look back at the core requirement that should be considered is, I want as many versions as I can get. I want to retain those for as long as I can. And I want my recovery process to give me the ability to bring my data back and operate my applications and my user workflows in as short a possible period of time. I mean, that should be the goal. Nobody wants the opposite of those things. So when we look at a solution that's based on snapshotting and replication, a lot of those requirements just naturally occur. So in our solution, as you can see in the slides, we're showing a production copy, a DR copy, but we're also showing a third copy on another isolon. So if we look at this picture and explain what's very important about this picture, the first thing is the green box. Many AirGap solutions make copies, but you don't want to copy already encrypted data into your clean room or your vault. If you did that, you defeat the purpose of having an offline copy of your data. Offline meaning not on your network, not pingable, not reachable. And we'll talk about that in a second. but you don't want that data corrupted by copying blindly data into this clean room. So how do you prevent that? Well, we've integrated our AirGap strategy as part of Ransomware Defender, which not only can lock out, as Dorothy mentioned, but it can also look at suspicious behavior. So a suspicious behavior is something that we choose not to lock out because it's not a behavior that we think is ransomware, but it's still a suspicious user behavior. So we can automatically suspend copy operations with the goal being, let's keep the clean data clean and let's not copy potentially compromised data into the clean room. I mean, you should do everything possible to make your clean room the cleanest copy of your data, period. Traditional backup solutions, right, they'll just happily back up whatever they see, and you want to avoid that. So this will proactively suspend copy operations and then resume them only after an administrator looks at the behavior and decides it's okay, and it'll automatically resume. So it's proactively monitoring the user behaviors and ensuring that it's safe to copy. That's the first thing that's important. The next thing that's important is the networking. So you don't want any manual processes here. So again, we're going to automate the opening and closing of the network. And that's basically being done using a static route. So the production cluster in this diagram, its route table when the networking is shut down does not know how to reach the vault isolon. That vault isolon at the bottom is not connected to the network in any way. So you can't ping it, you can't log into it. It's a completely unmanaged offline device. When we want to replicate, we don't give control of the replication to SyncIQ because that's what is doing the replication. We take control of the scheduling, and then we will replicate the data. We'll run the SyncIQ policies to replicate down to the vault. But before doing that, we'll actually apply a static route, start the SyncIQ policy, monitor the policy to completion. When it's completed, we will shut down the network and remove that static route. The goal in any offline AirGap solution is to have your data offline as much as possible. In fact, the best solution in the world would be one where the data is always offline. But that's impossible because how do you make updates? How do you keep it current and updated? Well, again, SyncIQ works really well here because it is block level replication. So I'll go back to my 1 gig file example. 1 gig file, add 1 byte to it. SyncIQ sees that only 1 byte changed, it replicates 1 byte. Other technologies, backups, or anything that's trying to go from file to object is going to have to recopy the whole 1 gigabyte plus that 1 byte change because it's not block level differencing. It's just recopying based on the modification date of the file. So that gives SyncIQ an orders of magnitude incremental update that is block level aware, which means it's going to sync the changes faster than any other copy technology. The net of that means your data is going to be offline most of the time because it's the fastest way to make an update to that 500 terabyte or petabyte of data. So copy speed matters. You want something that is as fast as possible. The one thing that's often overlooked is if you have an offline device, you don't want manual procedures to manage it. I mean, as much automation as humanly possible. So while the replication is going on, the ransomware solution is able to use that window of opportunity to sneak through with a REST API call from the production cluster, get all the alarms off of the vault isolon. So if it has a hard drive failure, power supply, you need visibility to that. So we fully support in-band management, and we will forward out any alerts or alarms from the storage device. So again, complete automation, so you don't have to worry about that. And then reporting. If you're going to make a copy of your data, you need to track how that's going, pretty much like a backup workflow. So we also produce a dedicated report that shows all the data that's been replicated into the vault. If there's any issues with that replication, also an automated daily email will tell you if there's an issue with the replication. And you'll always know how much data was replicated, what's your change rate. So you always have a way to view what's happening. And it's also automated, so no manual steps. So we'll just take a quick look actually at the GUI for this. So if we switch over to the,
Sure.
so we actually have a separate login here. Like it's an icon dedicated for AirGap management. So once it's configured, you generally don't have much to do. It's path-based. So one question we get from customers is, well, I have a petabyte of data, but I only really need to make a copy of 300 terabyte. That's not a problem. It's path-based. So you select the data you care to protect with a SyncIQ policy and a path. There's also how critical is the data. You can now decide, well, this data is really important, so I want to replicate it every 4 hours. But this other path is less important, and I'll replicate that once a day. All of that flexibility is fine. That's all built in. You just create the different path policies, set the different schedules in our software, and that'll be automated. The same screen is also where you can configure the target static routes to tell the production cluster how to reach the vault. And on the same screen, we can also configure how to do in-band management as well. So this is sort of a one-time operation. You set it and forget it. You can monitor the status of the networking. You can even see job history, which is a tab here. So as sync jobs are running, you've got full visibility all on one screen. And then AirGap reports tab, that's going to show you the data that's being synced and how's that going. Is it successful, unsuccessful? So all that information is here. And these will be emailed out. And then in alarming, so if we go to the alarms icon, as we mentioned, there's our own alarms, but then we call these managed device alerts. So you can see here, there's actually, we call them proxy alarms. There's a few alarms coming from the isolon, some drive bays unconfigured and so on. So all visibility that you need, and these alarms are here. They will go out through email or syslog. So the normal sort of email alert syslog infrastructure is available. I see a couple of questions. So is AirGap included or extra? So anyone that owns Ransomware Defender, you have access to the AirGap release. There's no cost, there's no licensing from us. In fact, if you go back to the slides, the Vault Isilon does not require any licensing from us at all. So you just need to supply that Isilon. And if you own Ransomware Defender, that's it. Now we do have a professional service that does design and implementation and operational training of an AirGap, which we would probably recommend for designing this. There is a full guide, which we can provide the link to it. But yeah, there's no extra feature licensing whatsoever. Obviously, you need to supply an Isilon. There's also the faction option, the Dell Cloud. So there is another way to gain access to an offsite Isilon, and that has a different procurement model, right? That can be a monthly recurring expense, or it can be on-site. So on-site would probably make sense when you need rapid recovery, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And so if your business requires a recovery model that is as fast as humanly possible, then you may want to do an on-site scenario. We also get a lot of questions is, why can't I use the DR cluster to become the AirGap? And the reason we don't suggest that is that DR and AirGapping have polar opposite requirements. In a DR scenario, I want to fail over and have my data, let's say I'm just going to use 5 minutes. I know a lot of customers may have different schedules for their DR sync policies, but I'm going to use the one we see a lot. It's like 5 minutes. The goal with DR is to restart your business as quickly as you possibly can and be fully operational in the other data center. So that means your sync policies are going to run faster. If typically in an AirGap solution, well, not typically, always an AirGap solution, you need to take the target storage offline and have it not accessible over any port, SMB, NFS, HTTP, SSH, like nothing. You can't reach it. That's not something you would do to your DR site. You would not take your whole DR network down to AirGap your DR Isilon. So for those two reasons, DR is solving a different problem. AirGap, you would typically run your sync policies, once a day, every 12 hours at the most, because ultimately you need a buffer, you need a window of time. There's always a period of time where you uncover a serious problem in your infrastructure, and you need a period of time to make a decision, and you want a gap, and you want that gap to be in hours or even a day, because the last thing you'd want is some problem in production got replicated into your AirGap within 5 minutes, because now you'd be forced to use versioning in your vault to recover. So ideally, DR replication should be as fast as you possibly can, whereas the vault should be on a slower replication cycle to give you that sort of buffer decision time. So because of that, we'd never really recommend trying to use your DR site and multi-purpose it, because it should be there to run your business when you need it to. So in the slide, you'll also see references to block level replication, and we talked about that and why that's important. So I do want to talk about rapid recovery. And rapid recovery is the concept of worst case. Source copies of data are unusable. So now, there's a bad day in the office for sure, but now your third copy is it. That's it. That's all you have left, and you need it, and you need the business to run on that copy. So, and we'll send out a link to the FAQ. We have a very good FAQ in evaluating, an AirGap strategy or solution. But one of the key requirements, as I mentioned up front, is I need to restart my business as fast as possible. So let's take a look at, I'll use a 1 petabyte amount of data. So it's a good amount of data. It sort of proved the point. If you went with a sort of a traditional backup solution for file data, what does the recovery look like? Well, I need a file serving device. So let's just pretend it's an Isilon. So let's say your source Isilon, it's compromised, you don't trust it. You'd probably want to factory reimage the nodes, right? So probably have Dell support come in, you reimage the nodes, you got a brand new cluster, it's sitting there. Now you've got all this AirGap data in a backup solution. How long does it take to restore a petabyte of data? And I didn't do the math, but I'm going to say that takes a week plus. For sure it's a week. It's a long time. So while that's going on, you're not serving data. You have no business operating. You're down. You're fully down. You're not partially down. You're completely down. You need that restore to finish. But we also just wiped out all the security information off the cluster. So data by itself isn't that useful. I need the shares. I need the exports. I mean, some environments have thousands of shares, hundreds of exports, hundreds, maybe even thousands of hosts. So the data by itself is not enough. You're going to need the share security, the configuration information. So that backup restore solution is long. It's very long. I mean, I was probably generous with a week. It could be closer to 2 weeks before you get that data online, mounted, share information, NFS exports all up and running, right? That's a long restore. So now let's look at the alternative. So the alternative with the AirGap solution that we've been talking about is, because the vault device is an Isilon, we can support a rapid recovery of a petabyte. I'll even say 2 petabyte, 3 petabyte, 4 petabyte. It really doesn't matter, in under 2 hours. And not only can we recover that much data, we can have it secured identically the way it was in production. And you'll be up and running, serving data in under 2 hours. And like I said, if you're evaluating a third copy solution, speed to handle the worst case scenario should be almost the #1 criteria when assessing what to invest in. So how does that work? Well, first of all, the data is locked and immutable in its normal state, because that's what SyncIQ does. So your vault copy is locked by SyncIQ. So what would that recovery look like? Well, you would have cables pre-staged, pre-run. These are data serving cables that are not plugged in under normal operations, but you would plug them into your backbone from the vault. This is that worst case scenario. You'd plug them in. there's a few DNS updates. Obviously, Smart Connect delegations, you delegate them to this Vault Isilon. You could re-IP it, but let's say you didn't. So a couple DNS updates. You join that cluster to AD. You do a couple of allow writes. So, you know, in a little run book, I'm at most half an hour into my recovery at this point. Eyeglass, of course, has a copy, the DR product, of all the shares and exports. We would simply delete the DR cluster from our software, add the Vault cluster to the software, and then we'd sync down all the shares and exports. So, you know, in 5 minutes, we've solved all the security problems. We just sync all the shares down. Once you're on the backbone, yes, the Vault device isn't the same performance as production, but that's okay, because in a worst case scenario, what would you rather have? Degradation of performance and have a business that's operating on your files and apps are up and running, or have to wait a week and a half, you know, before you have anything. So because Isilon can serve both purposes, we can rapid recover almost any data set size using this approach, maintaining all of the security of the data. Essentially, this is just a form of a DR. That's really what it is. So if you look at it that way, you know, Ransomware Defender plus our DR product are perfectly suited to solve this problem. Because it really is just a DR variant.
So obviously, I can see this question coming up is, so what happens if corrupt or encrypted data ends up in that vault? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so we try to take every step to mitigate that potential, right? So Ransomware Defender is looking at the source. If it detects and locks out, great, then I don't need my third copy, right? That's that always protect the data at the source strategy. Then we talked about, well, it's going to look for suspicious behavior and it's going to not copy data to prevent encrypted data getting into the vault. But let's go down the absolute worst case. None of those situations prevented it, and you end up with encrypted data in your vault, which every cyber vault solution is exposed to that risk. I mean, it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. That risk is never 0% probability. So what's the one single most important mitigation to the absolute worst case? It is versioning and data retention. That's it. It's really simple. Have many versions available to you and be able to go back as far into the past as you possibly can. That's it. That is, in fact, the only mitigation that every single solution that's out there has to offer. If we go back to what I was saying earlier, how does the Isilon handle that situation? Well, the answer is it handles it the best because of its block level differencing between snapshots and its aversion awareness. With SyncIQ, you can replicate, and then you can keep the snapshots that are used for the replication, and you can just keep them. And you set the retention on them. And that's just a calculation that lets you decide how many of those you can afford to keep. Obviously, money matters. So you have to decide how much am I willing to spend to get the most retention I can. But at the end of the day, the Isilon will be the lowest cost way, hands down, to take many versions of files, snapshot them, and keep those snapshots for a long period of time. It will absolutely be lower cost than S3 because S3 is not block level aware at the version level. So it will ultimately just cost you more. And so that is why we think snapshot aware block level differencing is absolutely one of the most important aspects of this type of solution, because it's retention, 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 and retention. I mean, that is your defense. That's really what we're talking about here. All this other stuff is about trying to keep the data clean, and that's all great. But at the end of the day, it's retention. That is your number one tool, to protect that data.
Just a question from Andy, I see here. So for that Vault Isilon, the third copy cluster, does that need to be in its own geographic location or separate from the production facility at all?
So I'll go back to that rapid recovery model. You know, if your business requirement and your file-based data is material to your business, I call it a tier 1 application, right? That basically the business can't run without the data. And speed is the number one criteria to be able to recover your business operations. Because if the file system is not up, then you're losing money. And if that's true in your business, then I would suggest Onsite is really ultimately the only real solution. If file-based data isn't as critical to your, maybe it's an Oracle database, matters more. I mean, it really comes down to the cost of the data and the impact of the business. Getting it off site, remember, we're not protecting from site disaster. That's what DR is for, right? This isn't about site failure. This is about logical data failure. So it's okay to take the AirGap copy and put it off site. You just have to realize that you're trading off rapid recovery in exchange for that. And that's okay. But I would suggest rapid recovery in a lot of situations is probably important, and therefore on-site may make more sense. But like I said, if the recovery could be elongated a bit, then maybe off-site's fine too. So I think that's the criteria that would matter there.
Sure, that's great. So for file-based data that's on the cluster, what are the best practices for securing that?
So, you know, again, we've talked about, you know, backup. I mean, a lot of customers do snapshot and replicate. I mean, that's what we see all the time. You know, there's definitely backup solutions, but more and more now we're seeing sort of NDMP type solutions. They're not block level differencing the changes to the file system. So there's, you know, they're going to have to copy the full version of the file. The change rate in a lot of environments is really, really high. And so they might start to not be able to keep up with the change rate. So, you know, again, SyncIQ keeps up really well in a lot of environments, from like a 4-node cluster up to like 50 and 60 nodes, right? So in terms of scalability, I would suggest that block level syncing with SyncIQ is going to outperform pretty much every other strategy.
Sure. So you mentioned the FAQ doc that we have available earlier. I think maybe we can cover some of these questions now around the AirGap solution. What are the common concerns that people have? Yeah,
so I think we've touched on a few of them, but I'll just try to summarize a few of them here. Is time to recovery. I would want to know that, right? I mean, to make a copy of a petabyte of data and store it, I'd want to know how fast I can use that copy. So that should be probably number one. Operational maintenance. I don't want to have to babysit that. I just want it to run and automate. So automation of all aspects of this is important. So probably number two, and covering off all the bases. And I deal with my networking, AirGap, deal with the replication, all the reporting, all the alarming. I don't want to deal with any of that. Just automate all of it. So we cover off all of those. Treat it like DR. Like I said, without the security definitions of how the data was being accessed with shares and exports primarily, don't ignore that. If you don't want to have to recreate that by hand, I mean, most environments that we see, it's not humanly possible. You got 1,000 shares. No one wrote down all the permissions on 1,000 shares or all the host entries on NFS exports. No one documents that. Don't ignore that. So that's a key factor here to get operational after a recovery effort. And then if I'm the number one overlooked area is, as I touched on, is management, monitoring and reporting. You don't want manual steps here at all, right? As soon as you have manual steps of any kind, that's where security falls apart. It has to be automated because people are people and make mistakes, they forget. So really automation is important. And then so we've gone through the demo. It wasn't too much more to show there. Like I said, once it's set up, it just sort of automates itself.
Sure. So we have just another question before we move on from Ransomware Defender. Raghav asked, what counts as suspicious behavior? What is triggering our detections for, a ransomware event?
So we have a number of detectors in the ransomware product. Normal user activity is not suspicious. So, open a file, close a file, copy data, delete data. Those things are not suspicious. It's all in the area of reading multiple files and then manipulating those files and done by the same user across a path or multiple paths or across shares. Because remember, ransomware sees drive letters typically, G drive, H drive, it sees drive letters. Those drive letters are different shares, but we know what shares exist on the cluster. And so we're analyzing a user's behavior from their IP address and their username. And if they're starting to do operations across two shares that are suspicious, it's a combination of all those things are factored in to a behavior. And a behavior that's repetitive is more and more concerning. So there was various levels of the detection, but at a high level, there's things that we would see someone do that we would decide to take no action, but we may decide it's better to just be proactive and not copy data to the vault. And that would be an administrative alert that you'd have to go in and decide, okay, no, this is okay. And then it would resume copying automatically. So, at a high level, that's what I would characterize that as.
Great. So we'll just shift now over to another important requirement for a lot of Isilon customers, that's auditing. So, whether it's for compliance, security reasons, there's a lot of users that now, must be able to audit their data. So Dorothy, I'll pass this off to you. What are some of the best practices around compliance auditing that you can share with us here?
Sure, thanks. So certainly, one requirement that we know is, part of all compliance standards, HIPAA, PCI, et cetera, is to be able to report on user log on, log off, right? The ability to do that. So how can, Eyeglass help you with that? Well, that's our Easy Auditor product. And it's a matter of enabling log on, log off auditing on the Isilon, right, which is available. Once that's enabled, Easy Auditor can provide the reporting, right? And so just to give you an example, what that kind of report would look like, you would know, I think the information you need for your compliance reporting, you'd know the user, in this case, it was a log on, the date and time, the cluster, and again, that really nice piece of information where they were logged on from.
Perfect. So obviously log on, log off is important. Is that the #1 use case that we see for auditing, or is there something else that is more commonly the primary auditing use case here?
Yeah, so the #1 use case we see for auditing is to locate missing data, right? You get the request, hey, I can't find my important file, or I can't find my important folder, right? This is often a result of somebody either moving the data, right? They had their finger on the wrong mouse button, or, it also happens if you delete data. And Easy Auditor has a feature specifically designed to simplify finding the answer, and it's called Where Did My Folder Go? And it's just a matter of selecting, let's say, the parent path. I lost my folder with my important files, right? So you enter that parent path, you enter a start time and how far back you want to go, right? And then you can do this operation against folders, but it's also available for files, which is, if you're familiar with the product originally, it was only looking for folders, but is now available also to look for files. Then it's a matter of hitting the search button, and you'll get, you know, if something was deleted, you'll know the date and time that it was deleted and who deleted it. And similarly, if it was moved and dragged, you would see the original location and the previous location.
So just a quick question on that specific feature. Chris was asking if you can do, you know, multiple days or search from a day backwards. Just
right.
24 hours.
So it's it is always a point in time as your start time, and then the number of hours you want to go back. So if you wanted to go back, you know, if you wanted to do yesterday, starting yesterday, it would be a matter of starting, you know, from yesterday and then going back the hours.
And the, you know, the common use case I think that we developed this for is somebody drags and drops file across the system, and, you know, support gets notified. And so we generally do know a point in time that the event happened, and then you can go 24 hours back from that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think usually you find out, you know, yeah. Now,
Sure.
this is an interface that is, you know, meant to make this really simple, right? This same data is also available. You can build a query, right? If you had, let's say you didn't know, right? And it was, it could have been in the last 5 days, then you can still build a custom query that says, I'm looking for, you know, folder deletes and folder renames that happened, you know, today going back 5 days. But in terms of being able to come up with a quick, you know, easy way to look for this information, the where did my folder go interface is here.
Okay, great.
The other thing, Dorothy, that might be useful to point out is that we have a read-only role for auditors. So if you have like a help desk that would be better suited to quickly find data, you could do that, right? With the read-only role. So
Yep,
that we see that
true.
use case quite a bit.
Great. So, you know, now with so many teams working remotely, how would auditor monitor access from untrusted networks, like, you know, a remote employee VPN, for example? How would that look?
Right, for sure. This is something we're all facing more these days than ever, right? People working from home, and the security of your centralized data in the data center is now exposed to the security of your employees' home networks, right? So in this type of situation, what you require is network aware security audit capabilities. And, you know, I guess the key here is 2 parts. One is we have the IP address where the client is connecting from, right, as part of the audit information. So that gives you that network aware capability. But we also have real-time auditing capabilities in the form of triggers. So what we looked at before, where did my folder go, is something you log in and you make an action, right? But the active auditor and the triggers, these are criteria that you can configure, and we'll notify you, right, if we find that we've had a match. So, for example, there's a data loss prevention trigger where you can set up for a particular path. If a certain percentage of the data, more than that, is copied out of that share, we'll notify you, right? And so it's very similar to Ransomware Defender. What are you going to know? You're going to know, you know, the files that were involved in the copy, right? You can download them, but you can also look at them here. You can know the user again, right? And then also that all important, where were they connected from, right? Where were they copying? Other one, you know, let's say you have data that you're expecting only to be accessed by a service account. So for example, in a hospital, if let's say PACS data should only be accessed by the PACS application, right? You could set up a custom trigger, right? With custom criteria that are based on a particular path, right? Let's say it's your PACS data path. And then you want to make sure the user, you want to be notified, not an event type. You want to be notified if the user is not equal to your PACS user, right? And then the other one, you could or that with the IP, right? You could say that, you know, somebody's accessing it from an unexpected location and then be notified automatically.
And what about, you know, monitoring access on sensitive files. Is that something that we can do with Auditor?
Yeah, that's a custom trigger as well. It's a matter of setting up the trigger with this option here, full path with file. And then if there's any activity against that particular file, you'll be notified. And I should mention also that notifications can be forwarded as a syslog event, right, to your external security tools so that they can either be logged or, could trigger another action.
Perfect. So we're down to, the final 10 minutes here. Andrew, I'll just pass this back to you, and maybe we could quickly cover any other tools that users could use, for reporting, for file compliance, classifying data, those type of things for Isilon environments.
Sure, and I'll just touch on those. I see a few questions in the chat too. I see a question about someone already having 3 clusters. Yeah, I mean, if you have 3 clusters, then yes, you could set this up. Obviously air gapping your data is that extra level of security. I mean, obviously you don't have to do it, but it's the best method to keep that copy of data safe and secure. But yeah, if you have 3 clusters in place, then that's absolutely possible to implement this AirGap solution. Also around embedded Auditor. So we were showing the login to the desktop with all the licensed icons. What you would end up doing is creating a role, say help desk, and you give them the read-only permissions in Auditor. So they'd log into Eyeglass, but they'd only see the Auditor icon. Everything else you can hide, and that's the easiest way to do that. And that's true for all of our products. I mean, you could create custom roles. So in terms of other solutions that we talk to a lot of customers about, we of course have real-time performance. We have enhancements coming around ransomware easy auditor, which I can touch on the next slide. We have golden copy, seeing a ton of interest there. It actually is a file to object capable solution supporting AWS, Azure natively, and Dell ECS, and a whole bunch of other S3 targets as well. So archive and sync mode. So we have solutions for those long-term data sets that you want to archive, and it protects all your permissions as well at the same time. Let me go to the next slide. Stephen, slide 7, I think. Yeah. So we've been asked about a lot of enhancements. We get a lot. What we are doing with ransomware and easy audit, we're going to integrate. We call it monitor mode, but essentially you'll have more capability to say, on this path, I don't want any lockouts because it's this type of application and I don't want that. So we call it monitor mode by path, user, or IP address. So basically just a lot more flexibility in how you protect the data on the cluster. Script engine, it's been there for a while for DR. So pre and post failover scripts. We're now going to integrate that. So now you'll be able to automate all kinds of things. The number one thing that we see a lot is if Easy Auditor or Ransomware Defender detect something, go out into AD and disable their account. That's one. It could be issue a REST call to a security tool to open a ticket. But pretty much any action will be something that can be automated in response to any of the auditor triggers, custom with built-in ones, or with ransomware if it's a ransomware event. So you'll be able to automate a lot more, essentially. We'll obviously publish examples on how to do that. Within Auditor, we're going to add triggers for directories. We do have where did my folder go, but that means it's already happened and you have to wait for a user to tell you my folder's missing. So we're going to add directory trigger support so that you can be notified instantly of a directory move and get ahead of basically get ahead of the problem. So today we have file trigger capability. We're going to add directories, so that'll be possible soon. And ACLs as well. For those environments where it isn't just administrators creating ACL changes, you might want to know who's making ACL changes. And we can search for ACLs now. That's absolutely something we can search on. But again, just to get ahead of the problem, why not get an immediate trigger every time someone does an ACL change? You shouldn't get too many of those a day, I hope. You shouldn't be like 1,000 a day. So that'll be a a trigger capability as well. And then the last one is cluster configuration auditing. The cluster's auditing capability supports logging who's made config changes, so shares, exports, and so on. We're going to ingest that and make that searchable. And so that'll just integrate the complete protocol and config auditing. It's a whole different topic, number 3, but search and recover, showback, chargeback, we are going to automate completely the entire ability to do pool-aware reporting. We're going to be able to automate billing, chargeback, data age, data owner, type, however you want to present the data in a billing chargeback. It will automate it, all done from the GUI. You create a report, you set a schedule, you send some email addresses, you put in a dollar amount if you want to charge money. And then at that point, it's when you set it and forget it. It'll just automate the email out to the business unit, to whoever you'd like. It doesn't really matter, but it'll automate all of the billing and searching and present out that sort of, you used or you stored, 200 gig last month, and 199 gigabyte has been not accessed in the last 5 months, right? So maybe we'll call it the report of shame or whatever you want to do with it. A lot of automation and flexibility in that search release, and it's in progress now. Our goal, our hope is to have that out before the end of the year. And so there's a lot of interest, in file pool aware reporting and billing and chargeback. And so that will ultimately be our solution for that. Yes, this video we'll put online, Stephen, to everyone. So yeah, we'll get this video saved. So I think we're coming near the end. If there's questions, we can certainly take a few questions. Hopefully this covered what you wanted to know. We're more than happy, sales@superna.net. We're more than happy to have one-on-one meetings for specific use case discussions, but we just had so many conversations around the data protection strategy and which, should it be S3? Should I use backup? What's the best thing for me? At the end of the day, a file optimized solution that is built on top of Isilon, integrates with Isilon, we think it's the right answer. And, we went through a lot of the reasons why. So we just thought a webinar would be a great way to answer this question for as many people as we possibly can. We will be planning other topics. We're overdue for a DR webinar. That's a huge topic as well, and a lot of new capabilities in the product. So we'll probably be scheduling one of those soon this year for sure, probably in November, because that's a popular topic always. So we will be hosting another one of these focused on that topic. Well, it looks like we had a good, great attendance. So appreciate everyone's time and support of the product. And I hope this was useful for those that attended. And, look out for announcements on our next webinar, which is probably going to be focusing on DR, as I mentioned. If there's other topics of interest, let us know. But we think that's the one that we have not done in quite some time. So I think we're going to go through the tips and tricks of what to do and what not to do with failover. It's still a topic that, education's key. Also, free training, I'd like to mention that. Stephen's team runs that. Right off our main webpage, you can book hands-on free training. So encourage you to get hands-on to any product you either own or don't own. In either case, it's 100% free. Our goal is to make sure you know how to use our products, and we don't think that should cost money. So thanks again, and look out for our next webinar.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Dorothy. And it looks like we made perfect time. So thanks everyone for joining, and we look forward to the next session.